I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we assess the fast-moving situation on the front lines in both Ukraine and Russia, reflect on what may prove to be an important meeting in Kyiv tomorrow, and hear memories and confessions from the team of the war in Bosnia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 22nd of August, 2 years and 185 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton Gordon. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia.
Let's start, as we have done for the last couple of weeks, inside Russia. Kursk Oblast, Ukrainian offensive action there still continuing. Marginal advances, they are small, but that's what we've been reporting about Russia in the east, and that's still that's notable. So I think this one is as well. Speaking this morning from the border area in neighbouring Sumy Oblast, President Zelensky, on a visit there, said Ukraine had captured another Russian settlement in Kursk Oblast, as well as taking more Russian prisoners of war. Now, during his visit, President Zelensky got reports from Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, General Syrsky, and also the Sumy Oblast Governor Vladimir Archuk about the situation both in the region there and elsewhere up and down the front. He put a post out on Telegraph a little bit later. President Zelensky, he said, in certain areas of Kursk Oblast under Ukraine's control, one more settlement has been captured and the exchange fund, that's the prisoner exchange fund, the exchange fund has been replenished. Then Governor Archuk told President Zelensky that the number of cross-border artillery strikes and civilian casualties in his region had decreased in recent days. General Syrsky is reported to have told President Zelensky that Ukraine has taken Krasnochepsko. That's about 10 k's southwest of Koronovo. It's just to the northwest of the Vishnevka village we've been talking about. It further shores up that area where the River Seine changes direction from running east-west. It turns sharply north. That corner, if you like, there's lots of tributaries, lots of little bits of the river branching off. I was saying yesterday that you could probably get an armoured vehicle through there, but nothing in any great size, no formation. Well, if Ukraine have taken Krasnochepsko, that's even further into that sort of morass of lots of little tributaries and what have you. And like I say, further shores up that shoulder from which they can Ukraine look like they are intending to head west. Now, just stick with that area for a moment. Geolocated footage published yesterday shows drone operators from Russia's 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, that's part of the Pacific Fleet, from the Eastern Military District. Geolocated footage shows them striking Ukrainian forces around Vishnevka. This comes from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. To me, that implies if they're using drones there, that Ukraine has the ground and Russia is trying to repel them by the air, but does sort of speak they are holding that part of the region. A Russian mill blogger said a reinforced platoon-sized Ukrainian attack from Vishnevka towards Komarovka, that's another 5 kilometres west along the line of the river, had taken place yesterday. But they said that Russian drone strikes and anti-tank guided missile fire had stopped Ukraine from establishing positions within Komarovka. That suggests, as I say, that Ukraine is continuing to try to push west through that pocket. Given the limited movement elsewhere in the Kursk salient, there has been some, I'll speak about that in a moment, it suggests that it might be the area that Ukraine is trying to prioritise to head west and clear that pocket up to the border area. There has been other movement, though. Other geolocated footage yesterday shows Ukrainian forces hold positions in forested areas east of Alexandrovka. That's about 5 k's northeast of Koronovo, and also elements of Russia's 200th Guards Motorised Rifle Brigade, thought to have come from the 14th Army Corps from Leningrad Military District, are holding positions 7 or 8 k's southeast of that, around the village of Sharalvi. Other Russian mill bloggers are saying Ukrainian forces are advancing north of Sudza, near the town of Malaya Lochnia. That's about 10 k's north of Sudza, about the same distance from those Russian elements near the village of Zaravli that I've just been talking about. Now, these claims are supported by other social media feeds that I've seen from Ukrainian sources. Elements of Russia's 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, part of what used to be the Black Sea Fleet, I suppose you can call it now, they are reportedly facing encirclement in Martinovka, 5 k's northeast of Sudza. I'm not sure if the Ukrainian push north to Malaya Lochnia that I've just talked about is an attempt to link up with Ukrainian forces further north around Koronovo, or to encircle the Russians at Martinovka, or maybe a bit of both. But geolocated footage from yesterday shows Ukrainian forces 5 k's to the east of Sudza, which will be on the southern flank of any encirclement of Martinovka, if indeed that's what they're trying to do. They might just be trying to bypass and push the edges on, or encircle these forces. We're not exactly sure. Now, Russian authorities in Kursk have begun installing concrete shelters to help protect civilians as the incursion carries on. This comes from Russia's acting regional governor this morning. Governor Alexei Smirnov said shelters were being built in crowded places, including in 60 bus stations, and he said similar shelters will be placed in 2 other towns. It comes as there's more footage showing that Russia is digging in around Kursk, around the nuclear power station and elsewhere, preparing or trying to prepare fortified positions. They just looks like they're just digging lines of trenches and anti-tank ditches at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any real concerted engineering effort. There is more social media footage showing Ukraine's forces striking those pontoon bridges over the river and elsewhere. I think it might be the same footage from a couple of days ago. I think it's from different angles or from a different source. I don't know how much is actually carrying on, and I can't tell if any of these Russian new-built fortifications are being hit as well, or the engineering assets needed for them. We're not sure. Anyway, elsewhere in Russia, a military air base in southern Russia was hit overnight by supposedly Ukrainian drone strikes, causing damage to several aircraft and surrounding buildings, we're told. Andrei Bosharov, who's the regional governor in Volgograd, confirmed the attack took place in the Marinovka village. That's about 300 kilometers east of Ukraine, 30 kilometers just outside, 30 k's west of Volgograd, Stalingrad in a former life, where a military airbase is located. You can find this easily on Google Maps. Have a look for Marinovka village. Just to the southwest is the actual airbase. You can zoom right in there. I don't know when that footage was taken, but I could spot what I think was some Su-34s on the pan there. It's been reported it's Su-34s and some others. I can't remember what the other aircraft were. I don't think they were 57s, but Su-34s reported there. I think that's what you can see from good old Google Maps. But it is a massive, massive fire. Footage showing that. It's all over social media now. Buildings in a northern suburb of Volgograd are understood to have been damaged by Russia's air defense response. A source in Ukraine's security service, the SBU, speaking to the Kyiv Independent, said that they carried out the attack against the airbase together with Ukraine's special forces, said that they had hit a fuel warehouse and bomb storage areas. The source said Russia actively uses the Marinovka airfield in the Volgograd region to bomb front lines in Ukraine. The strike seems to have hit both aircraft shelters and a climate-controlled tented structure, which is thought to be used for storing ammunition. This is all part of Ukraine's effort to stop the glide bombs and other air-launched munitions getting into Ukraine. The attack obviously came after Moscow was targeted yesterday in what the city's mayor described as one of the largest ever Ukrainian drone strikes since February 2022. Also, drones yesterday were in the area of the Kola Peninsula. Right now, that's near Murmansk, 2,000 kilometers north of Ukraine. Airfields were closed there. At least one drone appears to have been shot down over the Kola Peninsula. Defence analyst H. Sutton says it was an A-22 Foxbat drone. There's a great image on his site. If you look at the Covert Shores website, that's H. Sutton's site, he's got a good breakdown of what he thinks is Ukraine's air drone fleet. And the A-22 Foxbat is a kind of pilotless Cessna-type light aircraft filled with high explosives. I mean, that's amazing targeting, if they can get that far. Amazing Russia also didn't detect it and shoot it down on the way. There have been a number of suggestions in recent months that Russia is prioritising what little air defence it has outside of Ukraine to protecting Moscow. So that might be an indication there that there's not a lot between Ukraine due north up to the Kola Peninsula. Although I would have thought Leningrad military district would have something. Anyway, it's also worth pointing out that it's now 5 days since the Kavkaz oil depot in Russia's Rostov Oblast was hit by Ukrainian drones. That is still continuing to burn. Additional tanks at the depot has exploded in the last 24 hours. The fire is continuing to spread. A couple more for me, Francis. I note today's defence intelligence update here from Bretton. They're citing a report by the Russian investigative outlet Vazhnaya Istory. They're saying one of the units deployed to defend the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk was what they're calling a specialised motor rifle regiment, formed, unusually, from aerospace forces, as in the air and rocket forces. Personnel from there. Now, British Defence Intelligence, citing the report, say that this motor rifle regiment was formed in 2024, and they say that they are reportedly using personnel from the VKS, from the aerospace forces, including those previously required for specialist roles, such as early warning radar operators and long-range aviation heavy bomber regiments. They say diverting personnel from those high-priority areas likely demonstrates continuing personnel shortages, and by employing them just as infantry, don't mean to sound disparaging to infantry, but taking them out of their specialist role, they are not only being misused, but it will reduce the capability to retake areas of Kursk because they are not professional infanteers. British Defence Intelligence say Russia continues to develop new units and recruit more personnel to sustain what they call its mass attritional warfare approach to Ukraine. But the high casualty rates that result mean that Russia needs to continuously replenish frontline infantry personnel, which will, in their words, almost certainly continue to limit Russia's ability to generate higher capability units. A couple more for me. Moscow has used state media and propaganda to try to convince Russian citizens that the presence of Ukrainian forces on its soil is what they're calling the new normal. They're repurposing messaging from the COVID pandemic as in the new normal. Now, these new comms may be aimed at trying to justify to a domestic audience why Russia is prioritising maintaining the initiative in eastern Ukraine over immediately expelling Ukrainian forces from Kursk Oblast. Kremlin officials reportedly said they believe the push into Kursk is going to last several months. That reporting comes from ISW, Institute for the Study of War. Right, coming towards the end for my little bit here. Russia's Bryansk governor, so over the border into Russia, sort of northwest of the fighting in Kursk, up by the triangle bit where Belarus, Ukraine and Russia meet. Russia's Bryansk governor said this morning that what he's calling a Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance team were prevented from crossing the border. Alexander Bogomaz said the attempted operation took place in the Klimovo district. That's up in, borders Ukraine's Chernihiv regions, right up in the north, as I say, where Belarus and Russia and Ukraine all meet, about 200 kilometres northwest of the fighting in Kursk. So we don't know what happened there. I saw that reporting last night. It didn't develop overnight, so we don't quite know what that was. But I note that today, Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, the unit formed by veterans of the Azov Brigade, put something out on Telegram saying, quote, somewhere in the Kyiv region. They're showing, this was against the backdrop of a video with lots of action. Can't verify when or where that was taken. But they're saying, somewhere in the Kyiv region, the first footage of our offensive in full swing. Details later. Expect good news from the 3rd Assault Brigade. Now, that could be a new assault. It could be linked to whatever happened in the Bryansk border area last night. Ukraine has shown that it can get across the border in numbers if it wishes. It might be a policy of commencing probing attacks just to lodge the idea in Russian minds that they can strike anywhere they like, make Russia defend the border. We just don't know. But it's very. I would be surprised if the third Assault Brigade put out footage saying, "Yeah, we're assaulting here. Watch out for news later," and unless it's some super duper double bluff, and that's exactly what they're going to do. And Russia don't take the bait. We don't know. Elsewhere in Ukraine, just to finish off, Russian attacks over the past day in Kharkiv, Donetsk and Sumy regions killed 6, injured 28, local authorities said this morning. Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts are also attacked and damaged, but local authorities reported no casualties there. Francis, and I'll take a little pause.
Thanks, Dom. So lots going on in the military space. Also some eventful things to come in the political realm too. Tomorrow is a significant moment regarding the possibility of future negotiations involving allies of both Ukraine and Russia, with the Prime Minister of India, Modi, of course, visiting Kyiv on Friday. The Indian position, just to summarise it very quickly, it's long been one of condemning violence and condemning the war, but still works very closely with Moscow, particularly in purchasing the cheap Russian energy that has become available as Western countries have sought to sever themselves from dependence on Russian oil and gas. Indian foreign ministers continue to meet with Moscow's, and Putin and Modi continue to speak. In that sense, India's realpolitik is similar in some ways to Turkey's, although the Turks have done far more to assist Ukraine, arguably, than the Indians have. Some in the West have been quite shocked, I think, by India's behaviour in this war, seeing them as having a moral responsibility as the world's largest democracy to support Kyiv's burgeoning democracy too, rather than the dictatorship of Moscow. But as we often see, moral responsibility is the luxury of being a premier power. And India has many issues of its own, defensively, politically, economically, which may well explain this. Likewise, as explored in previous episodes, it has had and does have historic ties with Moscow. So it's a complicated picture, but don't we always say that? Anyway, Modi has just arrived in Warsaw, Poland, as part of his 3-day trip to Eastern Europe. He's already said something that's making tongues wag. Nothing can be resolved on the battlefield, he has said. A debatable statement which plays into the idea that neither side, Russia or Kyiv, can ever defeat the other because of the logistical challenges, something that is contestable, as we've seen from numerous wars in the 20th century. Whether he said that in agreement with one side or t'other, we don't know. It may just simply state India's position. But we should watch very closely what happens tomorrow on his visit. As we've discussed in the context of Ukraine's dealing with the Chinese, there is evidence that Kyiv is trying to get countries that are closer to Moscow to agree to certain principles, especially relating to Ukrainian sovereignty. So we should keep an ear out for the language that is used. Inevitably, though, the most important diplomatic work will be being done behind closed doors. It remains a point of contention as to the degree of foreknowledge, if any, certain Western powers had about Kyiv's operation into Kursk, for instance, although the absence of any alarm from European capitals in particular would suggest to some that there was at the very least a swift agreement once the operation began not to sow panic and condemn it, though others believe, and I have some sympathy with this, that at least one or two capitals knew something, but one for historians of the future, as we often say. Certainly the Germans are saying today that they were taken by surprise, with Chancellor Olaf Scholz condemning and denying those who say that he did have any involvement in helping Ukraine launch the incursion into Kursk. He insisted it was planned without Berlin's involvement. To quote him directly, Ukraine prepared its military operation in the Kursk region very secretly and without any feedback, which was certainly due to the situation. He was speaking in Moldova, which of course neighbours Ukraine. I'm inclined to think that was true in Berlin's case, by the way, due to the questions that have been raised about its information security. But has that been true in all cases? As I say, it remains an open question, and one will probably remain so for a long time. Now, turning to Moscow's more overt allies, Moscow and Beijing have celebrated the deepening of their political and economic ties today in the face of growing friction with the West. Trade relations were, they said, developing successfully and yielding results. That came from Chinese Premier Mr. Lai, who visited Kremlin yesterday as part of a 4-day trip by a Chinese delegation to Russia and Belarus. He praised Putin and Xi, unsurprisingly, for injecting strong momentum into bilateral relations, which he said had reached an unprecedentingly high level. Now, as we discussed yesterday, Putin is, of course, keen to show that it's business as usual diplomatically, refusing to cancel meetings or foreign travel. And this perhaps can be seen in that context, as he has also, too, had a frequency of higher meetings with the public lately. And one has to wonder if things were all dandy, whether that would be the case. Now, just to wrap up this section with a little bit more reflections on conscript soldiers. It's an issue that's come into sharper focus this week, given ongoing discussions about the fate of Russian conscripts captured in the Kursk operation. I want to summarise some key points from an interesting read in the Wall Street Journal about how Russia is going to extreme lengths to track down soldiers who fled the war, and how, when it finds these conscripts, it considers whether they should be prosecuted or redeployed. Now, it's a big piece, but just to go over a few things, it looks in detail at the process of recruitment, with punitive approaches beginning even before military service starts. To quote, army summonses issued online automatically bar recipients from going abroad. Conscripts are often coerced into then signing contracts by officers who are sent enlistment quotas from their superiors in Moscow. That's coming from lawyers. With no end debate for their military service, recruits are stuck indefinitely on the front lines. Desperate for a reprieve, some 50,000 have deserted or refused orders to fight, say rights activists. Lawyers who defend them say the numbers are much higher, since many are quietly persuaded to return through promises of lenient treatment or threats against their families back in Russia. Just another interesting quote from the piece. Among conscripts and soldiers alike, there's a view that if you come back to base after vacation, you are an idiot. The possibility of criminal charges is seen as a much lesser evil than the likelihood of death. Now, as a country seeking to weaken its reliance on Russia, Armenia takes many of these conscripts. And the piece also looks in detail about how Armenia is a bit of a fortunate base for many of these escaped Russians, though it remains to be seen whether there might be some deal that's struck between the Kremlin and the Armenian authorities to try and bring more of these soldiers to justice in Russia for fleeing. Now, just one other article which is in a similar realm. We'll put the one I just discussed in the show notes, we'll put this one in there too. So it's from the BBC, and it's a piece about how Ukrainian citizens have been arrested or condemned by the Ukrainian state for allegedly, or indeed being seen as, having collaborated with the Russians. It has implications, of course, with Ukraine joining the ICC this week. It's on the BBC, and it uses the case of a 54-year-old who was one of almost 2,000 people convicted of collaborating under legislation drafted very quickly as Moscow advanced in 2022. And in the interview with her, she explains that she did not cooperate with the Russians voluntarily. She said, I explained disabled people couldn't access the drugs they needed. Somebody filmed me and posted it online, and Ukrainian prosecutors then used it to claim I was working for the Russians. Now, she refuses to admit her guilt. She says she'll never admit that she was an enemy of the state, and as a result has been put behind bars. As the piece explains, there have been enemies of the state in Ukraine, people who have betrayed their country to Russia. One example given in the piece is of a liberated village in the Kyiv region of eastern Ukraine who saw a Russian missile hit a cafe where a funeral of a Ukrainian soldier was taking place. 59 people, almost a quarter of the village population, were killed in that strike. And it was later revealed by the security service that two local men had tipped off the Russians that the funeral was taking place, and that had then led them to sending the missile onto the location. So this is a real problem. But as the piece argues, those who committed serious crimes like that one are mostly tried in absentia, because they basically leave to Moscow. Whereas those who are in this sort of grey zone of having spoken to the Russians, allegedly, but were not actually collaborators, are the ones who remain and then end up in the dock, like this 50-year-old woman. So an interesting story which shows just some of the complex realities of this issue and underscores the ethical conundrums faced by some of the hasty laws Kyiv passed when the invasion began. So because of conversations we've been having around legal issues, etc. this week, I thought I would bring it up here. We'll have, as I say, both of those pieces, Wall Street Journal and BBC, in the show notes. So that's where we are in the political legal realm today. Turning now to regular contributor to the podcast, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, former tank commander, of course, and expert on chemical and nuclear weapons. Hamish, always a pleasure having you back on. I know you've been talking to many of your contacts in the last few days. Of course, it's been almost a week since we had you on the podcast last, when we were looking then about Kursk. We're looking still a lot at Kursk now. You've been talking to people, going around the bazaars, to steal your phrase. What have you been hearing?
Absolutely. One of the first things that Dom and I learned about at Sandhurst was when in defence, you almost always must have a plan to counterattack. And the best time to counterattack is immediately after you've lost that bit of ground. And I note from some of the Ukrainian bloggers, we're now in day 17 of the Kursk maneuver, and nothing has happened. And I think that is hugely significant. But I'll come back to that. I want to look at the fixation the Russians have with us, with the Brits, as it were, and particularly with some of our kit. We've talked often about Challenger 2, and on day one of the Kursk offensive, there was lots of Russian bloggers saying the Challenger 2 is all over the place, steaming things up. Now, the pictures, the videos that were put online showed a Challenger 2 to begin with, but the thing being blown up certainly wasn't. And there was some pretty poor editing going on somewhere. And I expect there are probably no Challenger 2s in Kursk at all. Having spent thousands of hours on Challenger 2 myself, if I had a choice, I would probably go for the latest version of Leopard 2. I think the other bits of Mark equipment, Storm Shadow, hold that thought, I'll come back to it, and UK Special Forces. Again, we keep hearing from the Russians that British soldiers, UK Special Forces are all over Kursk and all over Ukraine. Well, that is just a flight of fancy, and to allegedly show, well, not allegedly, but videos of dead soldiers on X and elsewhere with Union Jacks on them is crazy. I mean, none of the Special Forces people I know would certainly have a Union Jack on their kit. But that fixation, I think, is very interesting. And I'd just like to unpack Storm Shadow a little bit. I've written a lot about it in the Telegraph earlier this week, and it does have this aura of being a magic weapon. I also want to shout out to my good friends at the British Forces Broadcasting Organisation and Forces News, who've done a very good video of the sort of things that I wrote about in the Telegraph earlier on the week. So have a look at that if you want to see a narrative with all the various bits of kit put in there. But I think when you look at Storm Shadow, it keeps the Russians a sort of another 100 kilometres away, or makes life very difficult for them to reinforce the Kursk salient with Storm Shadow around. And that is what it does, precision, taking out key elements there. And again, by suggesting that Ukraine can't use it, it's psychological. In warfare, psychological is 10 to 1 the physical. And I hope our politicians understand that, not just in this country, but elsewhere. Absolutely critical. I've been trying to unpack, what is this Storm Shadow issue? And I've been able to speak to some ex-ministers and some shadow ministers. And the reason we're talking about this, last weekend, Zelensky very pointedly said to our new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, please allow the use of Storm Shadow in the Kursk salient, suggesting that, I think his words were, there are no summer holidays when you're at war. And that was a little bit pointed. And then later in the week, Starmer's spokesperson came back and said, the situation hadn't changed with Storm Shadow, not exactly saying what it is, because I think that there is some confusion. But the fact that we haven't heard the Prime Minister or the Defence Secretary for a while might sort of underwrite what Zelensky is thinking. And he's suggesting that we're not pulling as hard as we used to. I'm not sure that's the case. But again, it's all about perception, and we need to get that right. But looking at Storm Shadow itself, this is a missile developed with the French. It's over 20 years old. There is a view that there's some third-party technology in there that people are concerned about, but it was allowed to be used to protect Kyiv firing into Russia. We understand it's also been used in the Crimea, which, of course, is Ukraine land anyway. So there is an amount of ambiguity. And also, the Americans who have been accused of being the stumbling block here have said recently they see no reason, they are putting no restrictions on Storm Shadow. But having said that, they also said that they didn't think Storm Shadow was required to hold the Kursk salient. But going back to my point that we're now 17 days into this, I think any counterattack, counteroffensive now is going to be really, really difficult. I spoke to some intelligence chums of mine who were actually, as I believe, but not everybody, that, Putin is definitely rattled by this Kursk maneuver. He's probably not going to fall tomorrow, but he's very vulnerable to what we call black swan events. These are surprise events that have a major impact, but maybe in hindsight they weren't so surprised, if that's not a sort of oxymoron. But the two key black swan events here are, firstly, hundreds of thousands of refugees steaming eastwards who've been fed on a diet of Putin's strategic military brilliance, who are suddenly going, hang on, what's going on here? And the other element to what you've covered already is about the conscripts. For the first time, thousands of conscripts have been thrown into the front. And we've discussed about the combined arms maneuver, the amount of effort it takes to train and sequence and coordinate, really difficult. But these conscripts have got a few days training and can do little more than go forwards and fire a rifle, if that. So again, I mean, it is just shocking to look at it, that it is almost cannon fodder. So I think when we look at the Russian army as it is now, and we've discussed many times before, the sort of professional elite Russian army went some time ago, and to recuperate and rebuild it is going to take some time. Really, all they can do is to throw these untrained conscripts into the front line. And I think the final bit on this, before I stop, guys, is there is still this fear of escalation that one hears. I mean, a lot of it is embellished and developed actually by Russian bots. There are some very seemingly very English names that are spouting Russian propaganda. But I think this escalation is being fueled by them. It is very clear, 2.5 years down the line, Russian doctrine would have allowed Putin to fire at least one sort of tactical nuclear weapon on a number of occasions before and during the Kursk countermove, but hasn't. I just don't think it's an issue here. So I think in sum, the Kursk maneuver to me is a really, really significant operation. I know a lot else is happening elsewhere, but I don't see the Russians being able to take the land back anytime soon. Over.
Well, thanks very much, Hamish, for your reflections on Kursk now that we're a few further days in. I just wanted to bring in Dom here, actually, on a slightly different subject, but it's quite rare that one can share the airways with two veterans of Bosnia. And Dom, there was a story that caught your eye that we were chatting about before we came on air that relates to that conflict and may have implications for further down the line in this war. So, Dom, I'll go over to you first and then we'll bring in Hamish in a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. And Hamish, I'll be keen to hear your thoughts on this. But who remembers Bosnian warlord and bad poet Radovan Karadzic? Okay, so he was convicted in 2019 by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, convicted of genocide against Croats and Muslims during the Balkans War. Among the things he was jointly held responsible for was the massacre of 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica in the east. He's 79 now, and he received a jail sentence of 40 years, but that was later increased to life sentence without parole. He is held in the Albany prison on the Isle of Wight here in Britain. Britain is one of a small number of countries who have an agreement with the ICC to hold people who have been found guilty of war crimes. Not everybody wants to take them for various political reasons. Britain's one of them. So he's here. He's on the Isle of Wight. He is expected to die in jail. Now, he's back in the news in the last couple of days because he's attempting to sue the British government for inhumane treatment, alleging that he's not allowed to have a laptop in his cell. So that caught my eye. Now, the whole issue of international justice, accountability for war crimes, etc., it's a very, very tricky area. The whole thing is flawed. It's frustrating. You kind of hope that these things break the right way, but there's no real precedent yet. It's still trying to find its feet, albeit it's taking a while. But it's the best we've got, and it can work. And I just saw this, and in line with the things we've been saying in recent days, there is no inevitability to a Russian victory here in the war with Ukraine. There is no inevitability that Putin's going to live out his years in peace in his Sochi mansion. If enough people put enough effort into the right places, maybe one day Putin will be complaining that he hasn't got a nice view out of his cell window. A bit like, Karadzic is going on about his laptop. So, it can happen. But I just thought it's worth noting. A lot of commentary is this is inexorable. What can we do about Putin? You can't do anything about Putin. He's going to be there forever, no matter how the war ends. It doesn't have to be that way. And I just thought Karadzic is a salutary reminder that it can work. The ICC can work, and states such as Britain and others are willing to step up and say, well, we'll have him. At our cost, the taxpayers' cost. I don't mind paying my part of that bill. But it just shows that it can work, and there is no inevitability that these people are going to get away with their crimes. I saw that, and it just resonated with what we've been talking about recently, Francis.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Tom. Well, let's just stay a little bit longer on Bosnia, because, as I say, I think it's got lots of interesting reference points for today. So, Dom, for those who aren't familiar with Bosnia, I'm not going to ask you to summarise the whole war. It's obviously part in the context of the collapse of Yugoslavia, which is very complex for those who weren't living through it at the time. But you were on tour there. I think you accidentally invaded another country, didn't you? The first of two countries you've accidentally invaded. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then just a little bit more about your experiences there. And then we'll bring in Hamish, who also served. And when you think about Bosnia, when you think back to that time, there is obviously the ramifications legally for the reasons you've talked about, that these warlords, these individuals who were responsible for war crimes were eventually arrested and imprisoned. So that's one lesson it's interesting to reflect on. But when you think about militarily and the idea of Western intervention, preemptive or indeed after the fact, what do you take away from that slightly forgotten war on European soil?
I mean, it's an interesting one, and I've just been corrected by one of our brilliant listeners, Andrea, thank you for that, that it was the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that prosecuted Karadzic, not the ICC, but it went through the mechanism. I think the sentencing went through the mechanism of ICC, but please correct me if I'm off on that one. What do I remember of it? Well, it was an interesting time because it was one of the very few times when NATO took action, when a NATO state had not been attacked. But it was the start of this idea about the R2P, the responsibility to protect, this idea that some things shouldn't be allowed to go unanswered. And the point about standing up to bullies is that you have to be a bigger bully. And NATO decided that they would step in through the mechanisms of what were they called, I-Force, intervention force and what have you, in Bosnia and subsequently in Kosovo. It was an interesting time. We've not really seen it since. It was that idea possibly died in Iraq, but I wonder if there's time now for it to be rekindled. It wasn't a bad idea, it was just poorly executed elsewhere. But this idea that people should be able to just ride roughshod, even in what may have been considered an internal civil war, there comes a point where who's going to stand up for the civilians and stand up for the rights of humanity that are being ridden over, roughshod over. So it was a very interesting time. It obviously led to a lot of the instability that we see now. There's still KFOR, Kosovo Force in Kosovo. Still a UN mandated military mission there. Still British troops in Kosovo among with others. I mean, it rumbles on. There's still UN troops in Cyprus. I mean, sometimes these things are incredibly messy and they leave a very long shadow. I think the idea of R2P, responsibility to protect, was somewhat undone by Iraq. But I just throw that out there. Is it time for wise heads, wise counsel to put these ideas back on the international agenda?
Just because people are messaging me about it, Dom, which were the two countries you invaded and which was the first one in Bosnia? Right,
okay, very briefly, story for another day. So I was flying helicopters in Bosnia in when was it? 99, something like that. I was asked to go and do a range recce, go and clear an area, pick up a guy from the household cavalry, or household division, the blue, red, blue, pick him up, go and do a range recce, make sure it's all clear. So I flew up to go and get him. He's right up on the border. His base was right up on the border with Republika Srpska, which was the bit of Bosnia, basically wanted to be Serbia, paraphrasing. It was all very cloudy, couldn't really see where I was going. The map always looks very difficult at sort of 2,000 feet. And I saw a base as the sort of fog retreated. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. Fog retreated as the sun was coming up. I saw an air base, or I saw a base, military base. Well, that must be it. I'll go down and pick up Charlie Charles, or whatever the bloke's name was. And so I landed on, nobody waiting there at the apportioned time. And then I saw this rather scruffy individual with long hair and dirty uniform emerge out of the fog towards me. And I thought, well, long hair, scruffy uniform could be the household division. That may well be him. And as he approached me, I saw that I didn't think it was a Brit, but he had a blue and white stripy T-shirt on underneath his combat shirt. So I thought, well, this is a NATO operation. He must be from Greece. And I thought, I don't speak any Greek. He might not speak any English. So bizarrely, we've both done our pre-deployment training. Our common language might actually be Serbo-Croat. So I thought, right, I'll dust that off. So I said to him, Dobar dan, which is like, good day, normally used from sort of mid-morning onwards. So this guy picked me up and he went, Dobre jutro, which means good morning. And you say that early in the morning. And I thought, bloody hell, these Greeks know their stuff. He's already picking me up on the intricacies of Serbo-Croat grammar. Anyway, it just didn't feel right. I still couldn't see nice floppy-haired Charlie Charles running out the fog towards me saying, sorry, big breakfast, or words to that effect. I looked over at my helicopter with my mate Phil sat in it. And this was in the early days of when the Kosovo campaign was just kicking off. So we had loads of weapons on our helicopter. We had all the NATO codes, radio codes for all the for the whole theatre, because Bosnia and Kosovo, we had all the same sort of codes. So I thought that's a little bit, this doesn't feel right. Still gave the old Serbo-Croat a whirl. So I said to this guy in pure Serbo-Croat, where are you from? And he said, I was kind of hoping he'd say Chelsea, but he said Belgrade, which was a bit of a shock. And I looked over again, and Phil was, picking his nose or doing whatever he was doing, sat in a cab full of weapons and all the rest of it. And, oh, God, I had to whisper out the side of my mouth. I said, Phil, it's a Serb base, mate. Get in the cab and wind her up. And so we had to very quickly sort of make our apologies and fly off. And the base I was actually after was about 200 metres away, which, like I say, is very difficult to see in the fog and all that kind of stuff. But yes, a technical breach of the Dayton Accords and an act of war. But hey, anyone can make mistakes, Francis. So that's that. The other one I will keep is a story for another day. The second country I've accidentally invaded.
Well, I know listeners will be eagerly anticipating hearing that one, Dom. Thanks for that. I think you've referenced that story before, but it's never actually been relayed to listeners. So there you go. I'm glad that we finally heard the truth. Hamish, thanks for your patience on Bosnia. It was great to be able to bring you in on this. I hope you haven't also invaded a country by accident, but if you have, do say it's a safe space here. It's not like anyone's listening. But when you reflect on Bosnia, Hamish, what do you think about that time in terms of the implications for defence today? Do you think NATO went about it the right way? How do you think about it?
Well, pretty profound, actually. And before I come on to it, I'd make two observations about Dom's story. First of all, it didn't sound like officer flying weather. So presumably your chum picking his nose was a sergeant or something like that. And a few years before, I was escorting some senior NATO officers around theatre up north of the metal factory. And we went across the Serb lines as well. And I was just in a Land Rover, geographically embarrassed, which was not surprising for a young tank captain. And about 50 yards away, I saw some Serbs coming out to approach us. And as a true coward, I got the generals back in the Land Rover, turned around and went back to our side very, very quickly, but got away with it. But my profound thought about Bosnia, and I was there when it was changing from a UN mission to a NATO mission, but some of you who might have read my book, still available at all good bookshops, know that I spent many years going in and out of Syria, collecting evidence of Assad's use of chemical weapons. And I met many wonderful people in Syria who always said to me, Hamish, why is the UK, why is the international community leaving us to our fate? You guys did the right thing in Bosnia and Kosovo. You went into Iraq and Afghanistan, but you're leaving us to our fate. The only thing I could say to them, some years ago, I was in Bosnia and Kosovo, and there were some politicians and generals who committed genocide and did horrendous things like Assad is doing with his support from Russians. And they are now in jail I sort of said The Hague. I hadn't realised that some of them were in this country. But they were in jail, and they will never go, and they've got their comeuppance. And I said, I hope one day the same will be for you guys, because there's no way that the UK and NATO are going to come and save you. And I was delighted, actually, when the ICC and also the German government issued arrest warrants for Assad for the use of chemical weapons, and a very tiny bit was some of the evidence that I collected. So that was my memory. The other memory I have, and people listening to this podcast will know, a very brave man called Aimen, who was originally a jihadist. He was al-Qaeda. He then joined the UK security services, and his book, 9 Lives, which I absolutely recommend to anybody to read, is about his time behind the lines in al-Qaeda. I got to know him because he was the chemical weapons guy in al-Qaeda and did amazing work for this country and peace for 10 years or so before, unfortunately, he was exposed. The point being, we worked out that he was actually in Bosnia as a young al-Qaeda jihadist about the same time I was there, and we probably crossed very closely at certain times. So, yeah, it does seem a long time ago, although, as Dom says, it's still a bit tricky in certain areas, but, Sarajevo today is a very different place from what it was in 1995. Over.
Coming up, Dom and Hamish's final thoughts. Well, thank you both very much for your reflections of that time. Let's just hope no international lawyers are listening after some of the admissions made today. But that just brings us to the end of the programme. Any final thoughts, Dom? Let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So I note today the Kyiv Independent are reporting that Russia has launched a criminal investigation into CNN correspondent Nick Walsh and Ukrainian journalist Gianna Butsko on Alessia Borovic on the grounds of what they're calling an illegal border crossing. They've been reporting on Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast, and Russia's got very upset about this. This is coming out of, Kyiv India are citing TASS, the Russian state-owned news agency. Now, the FSB has previously opened a criminal case on similar grounds against a journalist and a cameraman of the Italian RAI1 channel, Stefani Battistini and Simone Traini. Now, last Friday, Russia's foreign ministry summoned the Italian ambassador over that, regarding that news team, accusing them of illegally crossing the border into Kursk from Ukraine and promising to press criminal charges against the journalists. Now, I would like to report from the region, but obviously I don't want to break any Russian laws. That would be very naughty. So this morning I've been trying to call the Russian embassy here in London to ask if I could get a visa to go and report. Slightly complicated by the fact that we've all been sanctioned by Russia, but I thought I'd bluff that bit. But I didn't get that far, Francis, because they just kept hanging up on me. So I'm afraid if I go to the region and report, then I will possibly also be cited as illegally crossing the border. So I apologise in advance.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. God, we're going to get in so much trouble for this episode. Hamish, you've got the very final thoughts for today.
Well, thanks very much. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to comment on the latest Russian turtle tank. I find it quite extraordinary that Putin's greatest tank, his T-90, has been repurposed and covered in a sort of steel box. And I will, anybody who follows my Twitter, I mean, you will have seen it, but I will retweet it. A great big steel box and a whole bunch of mesh. And actually, it means that the tank really can't, fire its weapon at all. And why the Russians are spending so much time in engineering on repurposing Putin's greatest tank is just beyond me. Perhaps they ought to, spend a bit more time trying to train crews to actually work them, and that would be far more effective than covering them in steel and then lauding it as the answer to the anti-drone capability. Anyway, fascinating pod today, and very, very interesting to reminisce about Bosnia. Just reminded me of Syria as well and some of the dreadful things. And I don't want to sound like some old fart, but people like Karadzic and others, they have lost their rights with the genocide they created in places like Srebrenica. And we should keep them alive as long as possible, fed and watered them. But, quite frankly, allowing them to have laptops and all the rest of it seems to me to be a little bit irrelevant and a little bit vulgar. Over.
Thank you both very much today for, as you say, Hamish, I thought a really fascinating episode. Many of us were not old enough to remember Bosnia. I'm one of those. I was born in 1992. So it's fascinating to hear your reflections on something that I've only read about in history books and watched documentaries on. So thank you very much. And thank you too for your more humorous admissions today. Don't tell David Knowles, everyone at home. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following us on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.